March 15, 2024. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Marcus Whitman had produced over 2,000 interviews in 15 years. He'd never seen a guest's hand move that fast. The slap echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Vincent Kane's palm caught Conan's cheek with surgical precision. 3 cameras captured it. 47 audience members gasped in unison. But Marcus wasn't watching the assault. He was staring at Kane's eyes. The same cold fury he'd witnessed in a Palo Alto parking garage 20 years ago. The night Sarah Chen died. Kane straightened his jacket, smiled at the cameras, and whispered something that made Marcus's blood freeze. "Some secrets deserve to stay buried, don't they, Marcus?" That's when Marcus realized this wasn't about a bad joke. This was about a promise he'd made to forget what he saw, a promise that had just expired. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Security moved first. 2 burly men in black polo shirts stepped toward the stage, but Conan raised his hand, a subtle gesture that froze them mid-stride. The talk show host touched his reddening cheek, then did something that made Marcus's 15 years of experience crumble into dust. He laughed. Not the practiced chuckle of a professional comedian deflecting tension. A genuine, almost appreciative laugh that somehow transformed the studio's electric hostility into something else entirely. "Well," Conan said, adjusting his tie with theatrical precision, "that's definitely going in the cold open." The audience erupted in confused laughter. Marcus watched Kane's face carefully. The tech mogul's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever reaction Kane had expected, this wasn't it. From his position in the producer's booth, Marcus's finger hovered over the emergency broadcast cut button. Standard protocol demanded he stop the feed, escort Kane out, and salvage what remained of the interview. But Kane's whispered words still echoed in his ears. "Some secrets deserve to stay buried, don't they, Marcus?" How could Kane possibly know about Sarah Chen? Marcus had buried that story so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. Almost. "Vincent," Conan continued, settling back into his chair as if nothing had occurred, "I'm sensing my marriage joke didn't land quite how I intended." Kane resumed his seat with fluid grace, his businessman's smile returning like a mask sliding back into place. "My apologies, Conan. Sometimes passion overrides judgment. Helena is precious to me." Marcus studied Kane through the booth's glass partition. 20 years had silver-threaded the tech mogul's dark hair and added lines around his eyes. But the man's fundamental stillness remained unchanged. That predatory calm that had made him Silicon Valley's most feared negotiator and most dangerous enemy. In 2004, Kane had been a mid-level executive at Nexus Technologies when Marcus was still doing real journalism for the San Francisco Chronicle. Sarah Chen, a Nexus software engineer, had contacted Marcus with evidence of massive government contract fraud, backdoors in security software, deliberate vulnerabilities sold to foreign entities. The kind of story that ended careers and started congressional investigations. Marcus had been ambitious then, hungry for the Pulitzer that would launch him into journalism's elite ranks. He'd met Sarah in that Palo Alto parking garage on a rain-soaked October night, her hands shaking as she passed him encrypted files that would have toppled Nexus and sent Kane to federal prison. But they weren't alone. Kane had emerged from behind a black BMW like shadow made flesh. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. Sarah's terrified pleas, Kane's soft-spoken threats about her family in Taiwan, her desperate attempt to run, the sound her skull made against the concrete still visited Marcus in nightmares. Kane had calmly retrieved the files from her purse, then noticed Marcus crouched behind a nearby Honda Civic, paralyzed by shock and cowardice. Their eyes met across 20 yards of empty asphalt. Kane had walked over, squatted down to Marcus's level, and made his offer. "Forget what you saw. Take this check for $50,000. Consider it an anonymous tip payment for a story you'll never write, or join your source in a very unfortunate accident." Marcus took the money. He told the Chronicle that Sarah never showed. When her body was discovered 3 days later, he attended her funeral and said nothing to the investigating detectives. Within 6 months, he'd parlayed his Chronicle connections into a junior producer role at a struggling cable network. Within 10 years, he was Conan's head producer, earning 7 figures to craft interviews with celebrities and politicians, while Sarah Chen moldered in a Palo Alto cemetery. "You know," Conan was saying, drawing Marcus back to the present crisis, "I've interviewed presidents who were less protective of their spouses. Tell us about Helena. How did you meet?" Kane's smile widened, but his eyes found Marcus through the booth glass. "Some love stories are worth killing for, wouldn't you agree?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around him, the production crew continued their work, camera operators adjusting angles, audio engineers monitoring levels, the script supervisor timing segments, all oblivious to the psychological warfare unfolding between guest and host. But Marcus understood now. This wasn't coincidence. Kane hadn't booked this interview to promote his new philanthropic foundation or discuss his latest acquisition. He'd come here specifically to corner Marcus, to force a reckoning 20 years in the making. The question was, why now? What had changed? And what did Kane want, beyond the obvious pleasure of watching Marcus squirm? Conan launched into another question about Kane's business empire, but Marcus barely heard it. He was remembering Sarah Chen's last words, spoken in desperate Mandarin as she tried to crawl away from Kane's approaching footsteps. He'd looked up the translation years later. Someone has to tell the truth. Now Kane was staring directly at him, still smiling that corporate predator's smile, and Marcus realized with crystalline certainty that his comfortable exile was ending. The production booth's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus forced himself to look away from Kane's predatory stare. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee mug, a ceramic piece Emma had made in her pottery class last spring, glazed in uneven blue swirls that caught the studio lights. The simple weight of it grounded him, reminded him of Saturday mornings in their Laurel Canyon kitchen, Flour dusting her dark hair as she experimented with sourdough recipes while NPR murmured from the counter radio. Emma. Christ, what would this mean for Emma? She'd been 28 when they met at a Whole Foods in West Hollywood, a freelance graphic designer buying organic kale while he grabbed emergency Red Bull for another late-night editing session. Their courtship had been refreshingly normal after the neurotic actresses and ambitious junior agents who'd populated his dating life. Emma didn't care about industry connections or premiere invitations. She read actual books, volunteered at animal shelters, and made him remember why he'd fallen in love with storytelling in the first place. They'd married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Marin County, exchanging vows under eucalyptus trees while fog rolled over distant hills. Emma wore her grandmother's dress and carried wildflowers. Marcus had cried during his vows, genuine tears for perhaps the first time since Sarah Chen's funeral. Now they owned a modest craftsman bungalow with a garden Emma tended obsessively, coaxing tomatoes and herbs from the resistant California soil. She'd converted the garage into a studio where she painted landscapes and abstract pieces that somehow captured the emotional weight of color. On quiet Sunday afternoons, Marcus would sit on their back porch with manuscript pages, editing interview segments while Emma worked nearby, classical music drifting from her paint-splattered speaker. It was a good life, a quiet life. The kind of peace he'd purchased with Sarah Chen's blood and 20 years of carefully maintained silence. Marcus? His assistant director, Jamie, was standing beside him, her headset slightly askew. 25 years old, with ambitious eyes and a USC film degree, she reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his younger self, hungry, talented, willing to compromise everything for the next career step. "The network wants to know if we should extend the segment," Jamie said. "Kane's numbers are spiking online. #CelebSlap is already trending." Marcus glanced at the monitor bank displaying real-time social media feeds. Twitter exploded with reaction videos. Instagram stories captured audience members' shocked faces. TikTok users were already creating remixes of Kane's slap set to popular songs. "No extension," Marcus said quietly. "We stick to the planned rundown." Jamie looked confused. Standard protocol would be milking this viral moment for maximum exposure. booking Kane for follow-up segments, spinning the incident into weeks of content. But Marcus couldn't stomach the thought of prolonged exposure to Kane's psychological games. On the studio floor, Conan was expertly steering the conversation towards safer territory. Kane's early days building his first startup in a Menlo Park garage. Kane played along with practiced charm, but his eyes kept drifting back to the producer's booth, back to Marcus. The studio's air conditioning cycled on with a mechanical whisper. Marcus caught the familiar sense of the television world that had become his universe. The acrid tang of hot studio lights, coffee dregs in paper cups, the faint chemical smell of makeup and hairspray. For 15 years, this had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd rebuilt himself from the ashes of his journalism career. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma, watching from home. "That was intense. You okay? Making your favorite soup for dinner. Love you." The casual intimacy of the message, her assumption that he was simply dealing with another difficult guest, another routine crisis, made his chest tighten. Emma knew he'd been a journalist before television, knew he'd burned out on the newspaper industry's declining fortunes, but she didn't know about the compromises, the moral cowardice, the woman who died because Marcus chose career advancement over truth. What would Emma see when she looked at him if she knew? The man who brought her coffee in bed every morning, who held her during thunderstorms, who encouraged her art even when gallery rejections left her discouraged. Would that man survive the revelation of what he'd done, what he'd failed to do? Kane's laughter suddenly filled the studio as Conan delivered a perfectly timed punchline about Silicon Valley's obsession with productivity apps. The sound raised goosebumps along Marcus's arms. 20 years ago, Kane had laughed the same way while stepping over Sarah Chen's motionless body, retrieving the scattered pages of evidence that would have exposed his crimes. Now Kane was here, in Marcus's carefully constructed world, threatening everything he'd built from the proceeds of that original betrayal. The interview had 12 minutes remaining. Marcus checked his watch, a vintage Rolex Emma had given him for their 5th anniversary, inscribed with "To my favorite storyteller." 12 minutes before he'd have to decide whether his comfortable exile was worth preserving or whether Sarah Chen's ghost had finally found a way to demand justice. The phone in Marcus's jacket pocket vibrated with an incoming call. Not a text, a call. His production phone never rang during tapings unless it was an emergency. Network executives, advertisers, or his own staff would communicate through the booth's internal systems during live recordings. Marcus glanced at the caller ID, and his blood turned to ice water. Sarah C. Impossible. Sarah Chen had been dead for 20 years. Marcus had attended her funeral, had watched her parents weep over a closed casket while rain drummed against the cemetery chapel's tin roof. He'd stood in the back row, a coward hiding among genuine mourners. Kane's blood money burning like acid in his bank account. The phone continued vibrating. Around him, the production crew remained focused on their monitors, oblivious to his crisis. On stage, Conan was asking Kane about his philanthropic work with tech education programs, a question that made Marcus's stomach churn, knowing the blood on Kane's hands. Marcus stepped back from the booth's main console, his finger hovering over the decline button. Some rational part of his mind insisted this was a prank, a coincidence, someone else with the same name. But 20 years of guilt had carved Sarah Chen's contact information into his memory like a scar. This was her old phone number, down to the last digit. He answered, "Marcus." The voice was soft, female, speaking with the faint accent he remembered from that October night in Palo Alto. "You look pale, stressed. This isn't possible." His whisper was barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. "You're dead. Am the first. How can you be certain?" Marcus's knees nearly buckled. Through the booth's glass, he could see Kane on the studio floor, still engaging with Conan about educational initiatives while somehow managing to keep one eye on the producer's booth. The tech mogul's smile had acquired a satisfied quality, like a chess player watching his opponent realize they were already in checkmate. "I was there," Marcus whispered into the phone. "I saw him kill you. You saw what Vincent wanted you to see, a master manipulator controlling the narrative, even then." The voice paused, and Marcus could hear city traffic in the background. "Tell me, Marcus, did you ever wonder why the police never found the files I'd copied? Why there was no digital forensics investigation of Nexus Technologies? Why Vincent Kane's career flourished instead of ending in federal prison?" Marcus gripped the phone tighter. He'd tried not to think about those details over the years, tried to bury his guilt under layers of professional success and domestic contentment. But late at night, when Emma slept beside him and shadows moved across their bedroom ceiling, the questions had haunted him. "The woman who died in that parking garage was my colleague, Dr. Lisa Wang," the voice continued. "A software engineer I'd recruited to help gather evidence against Nexus. She volunteered to meet you in my place because she knew Kane's people were watching me. She died because you ran instead of calling for help, because you took his money and stayed silent." The studio floor seemed to tilt beneath Marcus's feet. "Then you've been alive this whole time? Hidden, protected by people who understand what Kane is capable of. But hiding means the truth stays buried. Lisa's murder goes unpunished. Kane's crimes continue multiplying." Marcus watched Kane lean forward in his guest chair, making some point about the importance of mentoring young entrepreneurs. The audience laughed appreciatively. Here was America's newest tech philanthropy darling, the billionaire giving back to society while sitting 20 feet away from the man who'd helped him literally get away with murder. "Why now?" Marcus asked. "Why are you calling me tonight?" "Because Vincent has been building toward something. Tonight's performance wasn't random. It's a test. He's gauging whether you'll finally grow a spine or remain the coward who watched a woman die and said nothing." The voice hardened slightly. "He's planning something that will make his past crimes look insignificant, and you're the only person who can stop him. I can't. I have a wife, a life." Lisa Wang had a life too. She had a fiancé who still visits her grave every Sunday, wondering why the police investigation went nowhere. She had parents who spent their savings hiring private investigators who found nothing because the evidence disappeared into Vincent's network of influence. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering Lisa Wang's terrified face in those final moments, her desperate attempt to escape Kane's advancing figure, the sound of her skull hitting concrete, Kane's businesslike efficiency as he rifled through her purse, then calmly made his offer to the journalist cowering behind a nearby car. "What do you want from me?" Marcus whispered. "Justice, finally. But first, you need to survive the next 8 minutes of this interview." Vincent's real message isn't finished yet. The line went dead. Marcus stood frozen in the production booth, Sarah Chen's words echoing in his ears while Vincent Kane's laughter filled the studio below. His comfortable exile hadn't just ended. It had been revealed as a 20-year illusion, built on a foundation of lies and blood that was finally crumbling beneath his feet. Marcus stumbled backward from the production console, the dead phone still pressed against his ear. The booth's familiar sounds, clicking keyboards, whispered coordination between crew members, the steady hum of monitors, suddenly felt foreign, threatening. He needed air, space, time to think. Taking 5, he mumbled to Jamie, who nodded absently while tracking camera angles on her monitor. Marcus slipped out of the booth into the corridor beyond, his legs unsteady. The hallway stretched before him like a gauntlet, framed photographs of Conan with decades of celebrity guests, awards from industry organizations, behind-the-scenes shots of the production team celebrating ratings victories. Marcus had helped create this world, had spent 15 years building these walls around himself. Now they felt like prison bars. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Weird seeing you look so serious in the booth tonight. Everything okay?" Marcus stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Everything okay? His wife was at home in their peaceful Laurel Canyon sanctuary, probably curled on their sectional sofa with a cup of tea and her latest novel, completely unaware that her husband's past was detonating around them. How could he possibly explain? How could he tell the woman he loved that their entire life together was built on blood money? Before he could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Marcus looked up to see Janet Morrison approaching, the network's head of talent relations, a woman whose political instincts had kept her employed through 3 regime changes. Her expression was uncharacteristically rattled. "Marcus," she said, lowering her voice despite the empty hallway, "we need to talk." About Kane. Something in her tone made Marcus's stomach clench. What about him? Janet glanced around nervously, then moved closer. I got a call during the taping, from legal. They're asking questions about how Kane ended up booked on tonight's show. Apparently his people are claiming they never scheduled this appearance. Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. That's impossible. I have the booking confirmation, the pre-interview notes. I know what we have in the files. But Kane's management company is saying those emails didn't come from them. They're claiming someone spoofed their addresses, forged their authorization. Janet's voice dropped to a whisper. Marcus, if Kane didn't book this himself, who did? The corridor's fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, casting harsh shadows that made Janet's face look skeletal. Marcus thought about the phone call, about Sarah Chen's voice warning him that Kane was testing him, building toward something larger. There has to be a mistake, Marcus said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Legal wants to see you first thing tomorrow. They're worried about liability issues if someone hacked our booking systems to get Kane on air. Janet studied his face. You look terrible. Are you involved in whatever's happening here? Before Marcus could answer, his phone rang again. Both he and Janet stared at the screen, which displayed only a number. No name, no contact information. Marcus recognized it anyway. His old desk line at the San Francisco Chronicle, a number that should have been disconnected 15 years ago. I have to take this, he said. Janet looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Marcus's expression made her step back. Find me after the taping, she said. We need answers. Marcus answered the call as Janet's heels clicked away down the corridor. Still running, I see. The voice was different this time, male, gravelly, with the weary tone of someone who'd spent decades chasing stories through newsrooms and courthouses. Some habits never change. Who is this? Detective Ray Kowalski, San Francisco PD. Retired now, but I spent 10 years working Lisa Wang's case. 10 years knowing we had a murderer walking free because certain witnesses developed convenient amnesia. Marcus pressed his back against the corridor wall, needing the support. Through the booth's glass windows he could see the interview continuing, Kane gesturing animatedly while Conan leaned forward with professional interest. Everything looked normal, routine. But Marcus could feel the carefully constructed reality dissolving around him. I can't help you, Marcus whispered. Sure you can. See, retiring gives a man time to think, time to review old case files. And I've been thinking a lot about that October night, about the evidence that disappeared, about the witness who suddenly couldn't remember what he'd seen. Kowalski's voice hardened. Kane's been busy since then. 3 more suspicious deaths connected to people who threatened his business interests. All ruled accidents or suicides. All perfectly legal, thanks to witnesses who developed the same selective amnesia you did. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling 20 years of carefully suppressed guilt crushing down on him like a collapsing building. What do you want? Justice for Lisa Wang, and maybe preventing whatever Kane's planning next. Through the phone, Marcus heard papers rustling. Because make no mistake, tonight wasn't random. He's sending you a message. Question is, are you finally ready to listen? The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone in the corridor with the sound of his own ragged breathing and the distant murmur of Kane's laughter drifting from the studio speakers. Marcus slumped against the corridor wall, Kowalski's words reverberating in his skull like gunshots. 3 more deaths. 3 more families destroyed while he'd been perfecting Conan's interview segments and tending to his comfortable exile. The weight of accumulated silence pressed against his chest, making each breath feel stolen. His phone buzzed with another text from Emma. Dinner's ready when you get home. Made that lentil soup you love. XOXO. The casual affection in her message felt like acid on an open wound. Marcus thought about their kitchen table, where they'd shared thousands of meals and conversations, where Emma would sketch interview ideas on napkins while he complained about difficult guests. She'd never asked too many questions about his journalism days, accepting his vague explanations about burnout and industry changes. Had she sensed his shame? Had she been protecting them both by not digging deeper? The corridor's air conditioning kicked on with a mechanical wheeze, stirring the framed photographs on the walls. Marcus found himself staring at a behind-the-scenes shot from their third season, him standing beside Conan during a commercial break, both men laughing at some forgotten joke. He remembered that night, a particularly successful interview with a notoriously difficult actor, the kind of professional triumph that had once felt meaningful. Now the image looked obscene. While he'd been building his television career, Lisa Wang's parents had been spending their savings on private investigators who would never find answers. While he'd been moving into the Laurel Canyon house with Emma, painting weekend projects and planning garden layouts, a killer had been perfecting new methods of silencing threats. Marcus pulled up his banking app, his fingers trembling against the screen. The down payment on their house, $60,000 he'd claimed, came from a freelance consulting contract. The seed money for Emma's art studio renovation. The anniversary trip to Italy where they'd wandered through museums while he pretended to appreciate Renaissance masterpieces, never mentioning that he could afford the luxury because he'd watched a woman die and said nothing. Blood money, all of it. Every comfortable moment of their marriage built on Lisa Wang's corpse. Through the booth's glass windows, Kane was holding up his phone, showing Conan something that made the host chuckle appreciatively. The audience leaned forward, engaged by whatever private joke they were sharing, but Marcus could see Kane's reflection in the studio monitor. The tech mogul's eyes weren't on Conan or his phone. They were fixed on the production booth, watching Marcus's breakdown with the patience of a predator. Jamie's voice crackled through the hallway speakers. 3 minutes to wrap. Marcus, we need you back in the booth for the close. Marcus forced himself to move, each step down the corridor feeling like walking toward his own execution. He slipped back into the producer's booth just as Conan was transitioning to his final questions. The familiar chaos of production, camera operators adjusting angles, sound engineers monitoring levels, writers scribbling notes for tomorrow's monologue, felt like watching life through bulletproof glass. He could see it, hear it, but he was no longer part of it. So Vincent, Conan was saying, before we wrap up, I have to ask about your foundation's latest initiative. You're funding a new investigative journalism program at UC Berkeley? Kane's smile widened, and Marcus felt ice form in his veins. That's right, Conan. I believe deeply in the importance of fearless reporting. Journalists who aren't afraid to dig into difficult stories, to follow the truth wherever it leads, even when that truth is uncomfortable for powerful people. The words were clearly directed at Marcus, each syllable a perfectly aimed blade. Kane leaned forward in his guest chair, his voice taking on a tone of practiced sincerity. Too many journalists today are willing to look the other way when confronted with hard choices. They prioritize their own comfort over their responsibility to the truth. It's a form of moral cowardice that damages our entire democracy. Marcus gripped the edge of the production console, his knuckles white against the black surface. Around him, the crew continued their work, oblivious to the psychological warfare playing out on their stage. Jamie was already pulling up graphics for tomorrow's show, treating this as just another successful taping. The journalism program is named after a young reporter who died too soon, Kane continued, his eyes finding the camera that fed directly to the producer's booth. Lisa Wang was the kind of journalist we need more of. Brave, uncompromising, willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. She represents the best of what investigative reporting can be. Marcus's vision blurred. Kane was weaponizing Lisa's memory, turning her death into a public monument to his own mock virtue. The tech mogul had murdered a woman, destroyed her family, corrupted witnesses, and now he was funding a journalism program in her name while staring directly at the man who'd helped him escape justice. That's beautiful, Conan said, his genuine emotion making Marcus want to vomit. I'm sure her family appreciates having her memory honored that way. Kane's smile became razor sharp. Oh, I think they'd be very interested to know the whole story. The complete truth about what really happened to Lisa. All the details that somehow got lost over the years. The threat hung in the studio air like poison gas, invisible to everyone except its intended target. The studio applause thundered through the booth speakers as Kane stood to shake Conan's hand, but Marcus barely heard it. His phone was buzzing again, the same disconnected number from the San Francisco Chronicle. This time, he answered without hesitation. You saw it. Sarah Chen's voice was tight with controlled fury. "The Lisa Wang Journalism Fellowship. He's been planning this for months, Marcus. Building toward tonight." Marcus watched Kane wave to the audience, soaking in their adoration while Conan thanked him for his inspiring commitment to truth. The irony was so grotesque it felt like watching someone dance on a grave. "He named it after her," Marcus whispered. "He murdered her and named a program after her." "That's not the worst part." Sarah's voice dropped. "I've been monitoring the fellowship's funding structure. It's not just about public relations. Kane's using it to identify promising young investigative journalists, specifically ones working on tech industry corruption. The fellowship recipients get exclusive access to his companies for research purposes." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. He's finding potential threats, getting close to them. 3 fellowship recipients have died in the past 18 months, Marcus. Car accidents, suicide, and overdose. All after they started asking uncomfortable questions about Nexus Technologies' government contracts. Through the booth's glass, Marcus could see Kane lingering on the studio floor, chatting warmly with crew members while signing autographs for starstruck production assistants. The same hands that had crushed Lisa Wang's skull were now patting shoulders and shaking hands, spreading warmth and charm like a virus. "Why are you telling me this now?" Marcus asked. "Because we finally found something Kane doesn't know we have. Lisa wasn't just gathering evidence the night she died, she was wearing a wire. And the recording survived." Marcus's legs gave out. He slumped into his chair, the production booth spinning around him. "That's impossible. The police would have—" "The police never found her body for 6 hours. Kane made sure of that. But Lisa was smarter than he realized. She hid a backup recording device in her car's air filter, old journalism trick from her newspaper days. The recording captured everything. Kane's confession, his offer to you, your agreement to stay silent. 20 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled in an instant. Marcus remembered that night with crystalline clarity now. Not the sanitized version he'd told himself, but the truth. Lisa Wang hadn't just been a random victim. She'd been wearing press credentials. She'd introduced herself to Marcus as a journalist before Kane appeared. And in those final moments, as Kane dragged her toward the parking garage's concrete wall, she'd been trying to tell Marcus something about the evidence hidden in her car. But Marcus had been too terrified to listen, too focused on Kane's briefcase full of cash and promises of career advancement. He'd taken the money and run, leaving Lisa's evidence to gather dust in an impounded vehicle that was eventually sold at auction. "The fellowship isn't just about finding threats," Sarah continued. "Kane's been using it to identify the children and protégés of journalists who might have old evidence against him. Lisa Wang's younger brother just graduated journalism school. Guess who received a fellowship offer last week?" Marcus felt something cold and murderous settle in his chest. The pattern was becoming clear. Kane wasn't just eliminating threats, he was savoring them, turning his crimes into twisted monuments to his own cleverness. The journalism fellowship, the public philanthropy, even tonight's appearance on Conan's show. It was all an elaborate game, a serial killer's scrapbook displayed in prime time. "You've been alive for 20 years, Marcus said, his voice hardening. "You could have exposed him any time. Why wait?" There was a long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a weight Marcus had never heard before. "Because I was a coward too. Lisa died because of my story, my investigation. I've been hiding ever since, telling myself I was gathering evidence, building an airtight case. But really, I was just afraid." Through the studio speakers, Marcus could hear Kane's laughter echoing off the walls as he posed for selfies with fans. The sound made his skin crawl. But watching him tonight, Sarah continued, seeing him mock Lisa's memory on national television while you sat there helpless. "I realized something. We're not gathering evidence anymore. We're enabling him. Every day we stay silent, more people die." Marcus looked down at his hands, still gripping the phone. These were the hands that had taken Kane's money. The hands that had built a career on silence and complicity. The hands that had touched Emma's face every morning for 10 years, contaminating their love with blood that would never wash clean. But they were also the hands that could finally tell the truth. "What do you need me to do?" Marcus asked. "First," Sarah said, "survive the next 5 minutes. Kane's not done with tonight's performance. And Marcus, when he makes his final move, remember, he's not the genius he thinks he is. He's just a killer who got lucky 20 years ago. And luck eventually runs out. The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of 20 years collapsing into this single moment. Through the booth's glass, he watched Kane finally exit the studio floor, but instead of heading toward the guest exit, the tech mogul was walking directly toward the production area, toward him. Marcus's hands shook as he pulled up Emma's contact information. If he was going to do this, if he was finally going to tell the truth, she deserved to hear it from him first, but as his finger hovered over her number, he realized he had no idea how to begin that conversation. "Hi, honey. Remember that down payment on our house? It's covered in blood. Quite a show tonight." Kane's voice filled the booth doorway, smooth and conversational. He'd somehow bypassed building security, slipped past the production assistants, and now stood 3 feet away wearing that same philanthropic smile he'd flashed during the interview. Marcus slowly turned in his chair, forcing himself to meet those predatory eyes. "Visiting hours are over, Vincent." Kane stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the small space. The booth suddenly felt suffocating, all monitors and blinking lights and nowhere to run. "I wanted to congratulate you personally. 20 years in television, that's quite an achievement for someone who started with such humble beginnings." The emphasis on humble made Marcus's skin crawl. Kane was standing close enough now that Marcus could smell his cologne, something expensive and cloying that made the booth's recycled air feel poisonous. "The Lisa Wang Fellowship," Marcus said quietly. "You sick bastard." Kane's smile widened. "I thought you'd appreciate the poetry." She was so passionate about truth-telling, about holding powerful people accountable. It seemed fitting to honor her memory by supporting the next generation of crusading journalists. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Young people are so idealistic, aren't they? So willing to take risks. Sometimes they don't realize how dangerous their curiosity can be until it's too late." Marcus stood slowly, his legs trembling but his resolve hardening. "You're threatening them, the fellowship recipients. I'm mentoring them, teaching them about the real world, about the difference between noble intentions and practical limitations." Kane moved closer, backing Marcus against the equipment console. "Just like I mentored you 20 years ago. Remember that night, Marcus? How grateful you were for the lesson." The memory flooded back with sickening clarity, not the sanitized version Marcus had lived with, but the true horror. Lisa Wang hadn't been some random victim. She'd been investigating Nexus Technologies' government contracts, following a paper trail that led to Kane's illegal arms dealing. She'd arranged to meet Marcus that night because she needed a witness, someone from outside tech journalism who could corroborate her story. But Kane had been waiting. He'd followed her to the meeting, and when she tried to run, he'd caught her in the parking garage. Marcus had watched from behind a concrete pillar as Kane smashed her skull against a support beam, her press recorder skittering across the oil-stained floor. And when Kane turned to him afterward, briefcase full of cash in one hand and Lisa's blood on the other, Marcus had made his choice. "I was young," Marcus said, but the words felt pathetic even as he spoke them. "You were smart. You understood that some truths are more expensive than others." Kane reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I have copies of the bank records, Marcus. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every dollar of blood money you used to build this perfect little life. How do you think Emma would feel knowing her art studio was paid for with a murdered woman's silence?" Marcus felt something snap inside him. 20 years of carefully contained guilt transforming into pure rage. "You stay away from Emma." "Oh, she's already involved. Has been for months." Kane's smile became genuinely vicious now. "Who do you think recommended you for this job? Emma's been working with my people since last year, helping us understand your psychological profile, your pressure points, those anniversary flowers she's been sending to work, the surprise dinners when you've had particularly stressful days, all carefully orchestrated to keep you stable while we prepared for tonight." The booth spun around Marcus like a carnival ride. Emma's sweet texts, her concern about his anxiety, her gentle questions about his past, it had all been performance. His marriage, his safe haven, his 10-year refuge from the guilt, contaminated from the beginning. Kane placed the envelope on the console between them. Inside, you'll find enough evidence to destroy your career, your marriage, and your freedom. Bank records, photographs from that night, testimonies from people who've been watching you for 2 decades, unless, of course, you'd prefer to continue our mutually beneficial arrangement. Marcus stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of his entire life condensed into manila paper and malice. Through the booth's window, he could see the empty studio being cleaned by maintenance crew, the stage where Kane had performed his charitable facade, now being swept clean for tomorrow's show. But Marcus was done being swept clean. "No," he said quietly. Kane's expression flickered with surprise. "Excuse me?" I said no. Marcus picked up the envelope and held it against his chest like armor. "Do your worst." Kane's face went through a fascinating transformation, surprise melting into confusion, then hardening into something Marcus had never seen before. Raw, unfiltered rage. For 20 years, Vincent Kane had been the puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows, watching Marcus dance to his tune. The word no had never been part of their arrangement. "You don't understand what you're saying." Kane's voice lost its smooth veneer, revealing something guttural underneath. "I own you, Marcus. I've owned you since the night you took my money and walked away from that parking garage." Marcus clutched the envelope tighter, feeling the sharp edges of photographs and documents digging into his palms. Each piece of evidence represented a year of his life, a moment of happiness built on Lisa Wang's death. But for the first time in 2 decades, the weight of that guilt felt like strength instead of chains. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "You did own me, but ownership implies control, and you just made a fatal mistake." Kane stepped closer, his expensive cologne now smelling like decay. "What mistake?" "You told me about Emma." Marcus looked directly into those predatory eyes. "For 20 years I stayed silent because I thought I was protecting something pure. My marriage was the one clean thing in my life, the one part of myself that wasn't contaminated by what we did to Lisa. But if that was all performance, if Emma's been working for you this whole time..." Understanding dawned on Kane's face, followed immediately by something Marcus had never expected to see there: fear. "Then I have nothing left to lose," Marcus finished. The booth fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of the cleaning crew vacuuming the studio floor. Marcus could feel the moment crystallizing around them, 20 years of carefully maintained power dynamics cracking like ice under pressure. Kane's hand moved toward his jacket, but Marcus was already reaching for the booth's intercom system. "Building security to the production booth immediately. We have an unauthorized individual in a restricted area. You have no idea what you're doing." Kane's composure was fracturing completely now, his philanthropist mask slipping to reveal the killer underneath. "I have contingencies you can't imagine. Emma isn't just compromised, she's been documenting every aspect of your psychological deterioration for months, preparing testimony that you're unstable, delusional, a danger to yourself and others. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected tech visionary or a paranoid television producer having a nervous breakdown?" Marcus felt the truth of it hit home. Kane had been playing a longer game than even Marcus realized, not just maintaining control, but preparing for this exact moment. Emma's concern about his anxiety, her gentle suggestions that he see a therapist, her careful documentation of his mood swings. It had all been building toward this. But something Sarah Chen had said echoed in his mind. "He's not the genius he thinks he is. He's just a killer who got lucky." "Maybe they will believe you," Marcus said, surprising himself with his calm tone. "But here's the thing about evidence, Vincent. It doesn't care who's more credible." Kane's eyes narrowed. "What evidence? You think anyone will believe some conspiracy theory about Lisa's wire recording?" Marcus watched Kane's face go white. Sarah Chen didn't just call to chat. She's been waiting 20 years for this moment, gathering every piece of evidence you thought was buried. And in about 30 seconds, building security is going to arrive and find you threatening the producer of a major television show while carrying what I assume is either blackmail material or a weapon. For the first time since Marcus had known him, Vincent Kane looked genuinely rattled. His hand hovered near his jacket, caught between reaching for whatever was inside and the knowledge that security cameras were recording every moment. "The fellowship recipients," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "Tommy Chen, Lisa's brother. You really thought naming him as a recipient would be the perfect touch, didn't you? The ultimate show of power. But Sarah's been protecting him, feeding him information, preparing him for this moment. By morning, every major news outlet will have copies of Lisa's recording, documentation of the fellowship murders, and a very interesting story about why Vincent Kane was found in a television production booth at midnight carrying blackmail materials." Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, growing closer. Kane's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Marcus, calculating odds and outcomes like the predator he was. "This won't end the way you think," Kane said, but his voice carried desperation now instead of threat. Marcus smiled for the first time in 20 years without guilt shadowing the expression. "It already has." The security guards burst through the booth door with professional efficiency, their hands already moving toward their weapons as they took in the scene. Marcus pressed against the console, Kane standing over him with what looked like threatening intent, and the manila envelope scattered across the floor like evidence of some darker transaction. "Step away from Mr. Whitman, sir," the lead guard commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with unstable celebrities and volatile executives before. Kane raised his hands slowly, his mask of civilized philanthropy sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Of course, officers. Just a misunderstanding between old colleagues. Marcus and I were discussing a potential collaboration, weren't we?" But Marcus could see the calculation behind Kane's eyes, the predator's instinct to charm his way out of danger. 20 years ago, that silver tongue had convinced Marcus to take blood money and stay silent. Not anymore. "Check his jacket," Marcus said quietly. "Whatever he's carrying, it's not a business proposal." The guards exchanged glances, then moved with coordinated precision. Kane's composure cracked completely as they discovered the weapon, a compact pistol, illegal in California, and certainly not something a tech mogul should be carrying into a television studio at midnight. As they cuffed Kane and read him his rights, Marcus felt something strange happening inside his chest. The knot of guilt that had lived there for 2 decades was finally loosening, unraveling thread by thread. He thought about Lisa Wang, about the young journalist who died trying to tell the truth, and for the first time he could remember her without the weight of his own cowardice crushing the memory. The next morning found Marcus sitting in a coffee shop 6 blocks from the studio, waiting. The news vans had been circling the building since dawn, feeding on the story of Vincent Kane's arrest and the shocking allegations that were beginning to surface. Marcus had given his statement to the police, watched them cart away boxes of evidence from Kane's offices, and listened as Sarah Chen's carefully preserved recordings played back 20 years of horror with crystalline clarity. Emma never showed up. He'd called her after Kane's arrest, tried to explain everything in a voice message that meandered through 2 decades of lies and guilt and desperate love. But her phone went straight to voicemail, and when he'd driven to their house, he found it empty except for a note on the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I never wanted it to go this far." The coffee grew cold in his hands as he replayed their 10 years together, searching for moments of genuine affection beneath the performance. Had she ever loved him, even a little? Or had it all been Kane's elaborate psychological experiment, a decade-long study in manipulation and control? The bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and Marcus looked up to see Tommy Chen walking toward his table. Lisa's younger brother had her same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to his shoulders that Marcus remembered from that night in the parking garage. But where Lisa had died at 26 with her story untold, Tommy was alive and carrying her legacy forward. "Mr. Whitman," Tommy said, sliding into the opposite chair, "thank you for finally speaking up." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. On the table between them lay that morning's newspapers, their headlines screaming about Kane's arrest and the fellowship murders and the 20-year-old evidence that had finally come to light. Lisa's name was in every story, her investigation vindicated, her death finally acknowledged as the murder it had always been. "My sister would have liked you," Tommy said quietly. "She always believed people could change, could find their courage when it mattered most." Marcus thought about that, about courage and cowardice, about the choices that define us and the ones that destroy us. He'd spent 20 years building a life on blood money, convincing himself that silence was survival. But in the end, The only thing that had saved him was the truth Lisa Wang died trying to tell. Outside the coffee shop window, the city moved on with its relentless rhythm. People hurried to work, checked their phones, lived their complicated lives without knowing that somewhere in Silicon Valley, a monster had finally been caged. But Marcus felt the weight of every step they took, the precious ordinariness of a world where tech moguls couldn't murder journalists and buy their silence with briefcases full of cash. He finished his coffee, shook Tommy's hand, and walked out into the morning sunshine. There would be trials and testimony, media attention, and professional consequences. His career in television was over, his marriage had been a lie, and his comfortable life was dissolving like sugar in the rain. But for the first time in 20 years, Marcus Whitman felt clean.